of centuries of capitalism. In the capitalist system, people are held accountable for the work they do. If they do a bad job, they get fired. So they are motivated to perform at acceptable levels to keep their jobs. I notice I get a much better service and clearer directions in Shanghai and Guangzhou than in most other cities. The mentality is different. They seem to care more about you as a person. I suppose they have been more westernized, more capitalized. Living in China has given me a healthy respect for competition. When two or more companies compete, prices usually go down, efficiency increases, and you are more likely to get service with a smile. I remember living in Brussels in the early 1980s when it could take 6 months to get a telephone from a monopolistic government telephone company. In the US at the same time, with several private telephone companies, you could get a phone installed after a single call and in the same afternoon. Vive Adam Smith, but only up to a point. We still need national health services. Guanxi, not rule of law. Guanxi, pronounced Guanxi, is the Chinese term for connections, relations, string pulling, insider dealings, cronyism, and so on. That is a major component in social and business relations in China. It's the way most things get done, but fundamentally it is dishonest and unfair. It is cronyism, nepotism, and quite incompatible with the rule of law. Chinese culture is ancient, that is approximately 5,000 years old, and for all that time it has never been a modern democracy, or had rule of law that is the norm in more politically modern countries. Therefore, favoritism is the norm, and more qualified candidates for posts are often rejected in favor of candidates who have guanxi. This is not good for the country, because then the best people are not in the best jobs. As a result, the whole country is run less efficiently and effectively than it could and should be. In a country with a weakly developed rule of law, it's much easier to screw people and not be afraid of being sued. In the West, it's almost unthinkable to treat people constantly as suckers, to be taken advantage of and exploited if they are outside one's guanxi circle. In the West, if one is screwed, exploited, abused, wronged, then there's always the law and lawyers that can be called upon to take the offending party to court to be sued. In business, in China, contracts are often not met, and dishonest dealings are commonplace. Major business leaders who are now members of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, due to recent reforms, are pushing hard for business relations to be made contractual and not based on guanxi, so that if a contract is broken, abused or ignored, then the offending company or people can be taken to court. Since China is still a dictatorship, the Chinese media is not free, being subject to the censorship of the party. Hence, corruption and financial scandals occur all the time. CCP members themselves are often the perpetrators of these corrupt practices because they are in positions of power and are largely unaccountable. Without a muckraking tradition in the Chinese media, and the fact that the few whistleblowers who exist are often jailed by the CCP bureaucrats, it's not surprising that corruption is rife in China. The CCP is highly conscious that the general contempt of the Chinese people for corrupt CCP members may eventually bring down the party. So there have been thousands of prosecutions by the CCP against corrupt CCP officials. The net effect is that China now ranks in the upper third of the least corrupt nations in the world, with a corruption rank of 57 out of 210, as mentioned above. Still, the general perception amongst the Chinese public is that the country is deeply corrupt. The CCP faces a dilemma in regard to the endemic corruption levels in the country. To get rid of the corruption, a proper rule of law would be needed, plus a free press to hunt down and complain about the more notable cases. But a free press and legal openness is precisely what corrupt CCP officials who are in power do not want. A free press would result in an avalanche of criticism of the CCP, leading to its downfall. So the CCP keeps a very tight rein on the country's media. From above, we know that China has a press freedom rank of 138 out of 210, which puts it almost in the bottom third, a much worse record than its corruption rank of 57. It's clear the CCP is quite repressive about press freedom. So, as long as the CCP remains in power, corruption and guanxi will continue. These two characteristics make business dealings with Chinese very difficult for non-Chinese. They make China look backward, third world, unmodern. If China is to become a modern country, it will need to create a rule of law, a free press, and to discourage guanxi, which will be very difficult given its deeply held cultural roots. In other words, China needs to become a democracy. Then nearly all the above problems will be cleared away automatically. Puritanical. China is surprisingly puritanical. To a large extent, this is due to its third world poverty and the culture's great age. For the vast majority of Chinese people, and for the vast majority of its history, it had not had modern contraception, so it's understandable that Chinese attitudes to sex and the pleasures of the flesh are many decades, if not a century, behind the West. At the time of writing, Chinese sexual attitudes and practices are very close to those of the Brits in Victorian times, that is, of the later 1800s. In present-day China, conversations on sexual topics are generally considered to be inappropriate for polite society. That is, it's not Chinese custom to talk freely about such topics, in contrast to Western countries. What would be called erotic literature by the French or Germans, or girly magazines or porn by the more puritanical Brits and Americans, are called yellow books in China, with the word yellow having strong negative connotations of sleazy, low-class, lewd, etc. The unconscious, unquestioned Chinese attitude that sexuality outside traditional marriage is taboo puts China way behind the West. It has certainly not yet had its sexual revolution. The contraceptive pill still does exist in China and is moderately popular, but with the millennia-old anti-sexual tradition and a lack of a romantic tradition between the sexes, for example, parents and older generation go-betweeners choose the marriage partners of the children, thus merging families and often land ownership. But the level of romantic compatibility of the partners is often not considered to be relevant. Plus the dictatorial government, which is equally puritanical. It's unlikely that China will see its traditional anti-sex attitudes change much until China becomes a democracy. The Chinese CCP bans not only political messages that threaten it, it also blocks sex sites on the internet. I remember being surprised one time when I was with my Chinese wife, spending the night in a minor Chinese city, having the manager of the hotel knock on our bedroom door, saying that we had to show a marriage certificate, otherwise his hotel would be fined heavily by local CCP party leaders. Obviously the CCP disapproves of one-night stands in hotels, so different from Japan. It's therefore not surprising, given the traditional anti-sex attitudes and a sexually repressive government, that sex education in China is virtually non-existent. For example, my own Chinese wife has occasionally periodic outbreaks of oral herpes. She didn't even know what it was. She said it is extremely common in China and that it was some kind of fever. I can believe it is very common in China because I see it on the street everywhere. I assume from this, since there's no sex education in the schools and nothing on TV about such things, that most Chinese are unaware that there are two kinds of herpes, oral and genital. People can catch oral herpes by kissing someone with a herpes outbreak in full bloom. Perhaps her mother, in total ignorance, passed on the oral herpes virus to her by kissing her when she was a baby? Needless to say, I never kissed my Chinese wife, a situation so different from what I had with all the other women I have known intimately, save one who also had oral herpes. Western countries are full of sexual how-to books in the bookstores. Over the decades, these books have had a liberating effect on populations, ad-libbing now the way, say, on the internet, Pornhub.com has now educating the whole planet on sexual techniques. As people learn superior sexual techniques that bring sexual joy to millions, Westerners know about the clitoris, the G-spot, Kegel exercises, female ejaculation, multiple and continuous orgasms, etc. for women, and prostate and continuous oozing orgasms, etc. for men. In the Western countries, it's commonplace for couples to experiment sexually to determine their sexual compatibility. In many Western countries, the traditional institution of marriage is dying out as couples simply live together, the attitude being, with efficient contraception and both sexes having careers, who needs the state to give a rubber stamp to a private relationship? Nothing like the above exists in China. It's way too sexually repressed to have such knowledge. The freedom to educate the Chinese public into such knowledge does not exist, and will certainly continue not to exist under the current CCP regime. Especially the whole Chinese population lives in sexual ignorance and suffers accordingly in typical mono style. Since so few Chinese have had relationships with Westerners who have lived outside China, few of them know what sexual freedoms feel like. Most Chinese see sex as yellow, in the same sense as traditional Americans call sex dirty, a puritanical attitude they inherited from the Brits. To the French, equating sex with dirt is simply mentally ill. Young, more affluent Chinese, especially those with access to the internet, can often find sex sites. The CCP employs, I read, some 30,000 people whose job is to censor and block websites, largely of two types, namely those that are anti-government and those that are sexually explicit. Chinese students make it their business to know of software that circumvents this government censorship and regularly keep each other up to date with the latest anti-censorship products. Brilliant-minded computer scientists construct increasingly sophisticated anti-censorship software in a constant cat-and-mouse game with the anti-censorship software created by the CCP-sponsored programmers. These anti-censorship software programmers tend to live outside of China, often in the US. It's generally thought that the US programs are the best and the toughest for the CCP programmers to crack. Often these US programs are written by Chinese who have an axe to grind against the CCP, who resent censorship and use their anti-censorship software to fight the Chinese government. They appear to be winning, but only if you are rich enough and well enough informed to be aware of the existence of such software. The Chinese government is certainly not going to tell the Chinese public about its existence. Ad-libbing, for example, I use a company called ExpressVPN. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, which is a way to go around the great Chinese firewall, the great censorship of the CCP, of the internet. The net effect of Chinese student use of anti-censorship software is that they do get access to Western sexual movies, etc., and sex instruction books, and nowadays Pornhub.com, the biggest. The younger generation with internet access is being influenced by the much freer attitudes towards sex of Westerners and is changing its traditional attitudes towards sex, but not a lot. Personally, I don't see China going through a sexual revolution comparable to what happened in Europe and North America once the contraceptive pill was discovered in the 1960s, until the CCP falls and a democratic China modernizes its sex education policies and sexual attitudes. Until that happens, probably another 10 to 15 years from the time of writing, the Chinese will continue to live in a state of repressed sexual ignorance and sexual poverty. I've been shocked at times by the verbal venom of some Chinese women in the poor areas of some cities against their husbands. It's obvious to me these women are profoundly sexually repressed and have probably not had a decent orgasm in years. This contrasts so strongly with the bien baisé, French slang for well fucked, women of Paris. The French attitude to sex is so opposite, and it shows. There is a saying in French, une femme heureuse est bien aimée et bien baisée. A happy woman is well loved and well fucked. When I observe French women on the Paris metro and compare the high percentage of such women in French culture with Chinese women and men, I feel the French have a ton to teach the Chinese and the rest of the world on the sexual front. I think I'll stop here because the next section is on another country, which will be I, letter I, on India. Okay, so I'll stop here. Ciao.